You wake up one morning and everything you've ever written is gone. Every text message, every email, every note you scribbled on a napkin, your diary from childhood, the birthday cards your grandmother sent you, the love letter you never sent. All of it vanished. And not just yours, everyone's. Every book in every library, every sign on every street, every word carved into every monument. The entire written record of human existence, erased overnight as if it never existed. How would you explain your life to someone 100 years from now? How would you tell them what happened yesterday, let alone what happened in your childhood? How would you preserve the memory of people who mattered to you, events that shaped you, knowledge that took you years to accumulate? You'd have to rely on your voice, on stories, on memory passed from person to person, warping slightly with each retelling, details fading, facts blending with interpretation, until no one can quite remember what actually happened and what was added later to make the story better. This isn't a thought experiment. This was reality for most of human existence. For the vast majority of our time on this planet, we had no way to write anything down, no way to preserve exact information across generations. No way to create a permanent record that could outlive the person who created it. Everything we knew, everything we learned, everything we experienced had to live in memory and be transmitted through speech, through gesture, through demonstration. And when those people died, whatever they hadn't successfully passed on died with them. We call this period prehistory, the time but we need a new word to pray. Fail is done. The time before history, as if nothing important happened then, as if the story of humanity only begins when someone figured out how to scratch symbols onto clay tablets. But that's backwards. That's missing almost everything. Because for roughly 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans lived and loved and suffered and created and wondered about the universe without ever writing a single word. And for most of that time, we have almost no idea what they were thinking. The earliest writing we've discovered dates back about 5,000 years. Some systems might be slightly older, 6,000 years at most, if we're generous about what counts as writing. But anatomically modern humans have existed for at least 200,000 years, possibly 300,000, depending on which fossils you accept as truly modern. That means that for roughly 98% of human existence, there was no writing, no books, no records, no permanent preservation of thought. And that's just anatomically modern humans. If we include our hominin ancestors, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, the timeline stretches back millions of years. Millions of years of beings with brains, with hands that could craft tools, with social groups that required communication, with lives that surely contained moments of joy and fear and curiosity and grief. And we have almost nothing from them. A handful of stone tools, some bones, occasional evidence of fire or shelter. That's it. Think about what that means. Think about the sheer volume of human experience that has simply vanished. Every conversation between two people sitting by a fire 300,000 years ago. Every story told to children about where the thunder comes from, or why the moon changes shape. Every joke that made people laugh. Every song that made them cry. Every observation about animal behavior or plant growth or weather patterns. All of it gone. Not recorded, not preserved, lost to time, as completely as if it never happened. And yet, it did happen. People lived full lives. They had thoughts as complex as yours, emotions as deep as yours, fears and hopes and dreams that mattered to them as much as yours matter to you. They looked up at the night sky and wondered. They mourned their dead. They celebrated births. They fell in love. They made art. They asked questions about existence that we're still asking today. We just have almost no record of it, and what we do have is fragmentary, ambiguous, open to interpretation. A carved figure that might be religious or might be decorative. Ochre pigment that might indicate symbolic thought or might just be practical. Cave paintings that could be shamanic visions or hunting magic or children's doodles or something we haven't even considered. We're looking at the material traces of complex cultures and trying to reconstruct their inner lives from bones and stones. It's like trying to understand a person's entire existence by examining the contents of their trash. You can learn some things, what they ate, some tools they used, perhaps evidence of trade or travel, but their thoughts, their beliefs, their stories, their understanding of who they were and why they existed, that's invisible to us. That's locked in the minds of people who died millennia ago without leaving any permanent record of their consciousness. This is the fundamental problem of prehistory. We have the physical remains of human activity stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. We can trace the evolution of stone tool technology, the spread of human populations across continents, the development of increasingly sophisticated behaviors. But we're largely blind to the mental and cultural lives of these people. We're studying humanity with one of our most important sources of information, written testimony, direct communication across time, completely absent. And yet we try. We have to try. Because those people were us, not metaphorically, but literally. If you could travel back 50,000 years and bring an infant from a hunter-gatherer band into the modern world, raise them in a contemporary family, send them to school, they would be indistinguishable from any other person. Same brain, same cognitive capacity, same potential for language, abstract thought, creativity, empathy, all of it. The hardware hasn't changed significantly in at least 100,000 years. What's changed is software, culture, accumulated knowledge, the ability to preserve and transmit information across generations with high fidelity. And the single most important technology that enabled that change was writing. The ability to externalize memory, to create permanent records that don't degrade with each retelling, to communicate across time and space without requiring direct human contact. Before writing, knowledge was fluid. It lived in human memory, which is fallible, selective, prone to distortion. Oral traditions could preserve some information across many generations. We have evidence of Aboriginal Australian stories that encode memories of coastal geography from when sea levels were lower, over 10,000 years ago. But oral tradition has limits. It works best for information that's emotionally resonant, that fits into narrative structures, that can be encoded in memorable forms, like songs or poems or stories. Technical knowledge is harder to preserve orally. Exact measurements, precise procedures, complex astronomical calculations, these don't fit easily into narrative form. They require repetition, practice, direct demonstration. And if the chain of transmission breaks, if the people who hold that knowledge die before passing it on completely, it's lost. You have to start over, rediscover it, reinvent it. This is why prehistory is so frustrating to study. We can see evidence of sophisticated behaviors, long-distance trade networks, complex tool manufacturing, symbolic art, but we can't access the knowledge systems that made those behaviors possible. We can't read their instructions. We can't hear their explanations. We can't know what they understood about their own capabilities and how they transmitted that understanding to others. What we're left with is inference, educated guessing based on material remains and comparisons to better documented societies, and a profound sense of loss. Because somewhere in the unrecorded past, humans figured out things we had to figure out again later. Somewhere in the oral traditions that didn't survive, there were insights and observations and accumulated wisdom that might have been useful, might have been beautiful, might have changed how we understand ourselves. But we'll never know. The world before written history is mostly darkness to us. We can illuminate tiny corners of it with archaeology and anthropology and increasingly sophisticated dating techniques. We can make inferences about social organization, diet, migration patterns, technological capabilities, but the inner lives of those people, their subjective experience of being human, their stories and songs and explanations of the world, that's largely invisible. And that invisibility should humble us, because it means that the vast majority of human experience has left no trace that we can recover. It means that our written history, which feels so complete and comprehensive, is actually a tiny sliver of the total human story. The core is an explore. It means that people as complex and capable as us lived and died for thousands of generations without anyone remembering their names or their deeds or their thoughts. We are living in their future. We are the beneficiaries of whatever knowledge they managed to preserve and pass down, despite having no way to write it. We are walking on ground they walked, looking at the same stars they looked at, asking some of the same questions they asked. But we're separated from them by an almost impenetrable wall of time and the absence of permanent records. This is what we're going to explore, not a chronological history of prehistory. That would be impossible given the fragmentary evidence, but rather the nature of that gap, what it means to try to understand people who left no written testimony. What we can know, what we can infer, what we can never know, and what the existence of that vast unrecorded past tells us about ourselves, about the fragility of knowledge, about the importance of the technologies we often take for granted. The world before written history is not a void. It was full of human activity, human thought, human creativity, but it's a world we can only glimpse dimly through the shadows it cast on the material world. And in confronting that limitation, in accepting how much we've lost, we might learn something about what we're still in danger of losing, and what we need to preserve before it's too late. When we talk about the world before writing, we need to first understand what we mean by writing, because the line between not writing and writing isn't as clear as you might think. It's not a simple binary where one day humans couldn't write and the next day they could. Humans have been making marks for a very long time, intentional marks, deliberate symbols, carved or painted or scratched onto surfaces. Some of these marks are clearly representational. They depict animals or humans or objects we can recognize. Others are abstract, lines, dots, geometric patterns that don't obviously represent anything in the physical world. The oldest known engravings are from Blunbo's Cave in South Africa, dating to around 75,000 years ago. They're patterns of crossed lines scratched into pieces of ochre. Are they decorative, symbolic, proto-writing? We don't know. But someone intentionally made them, which means they had some purpose, some meaning to the person who created them. There are notched bones from various sites in Africa and Europe, dating back tens of thousands of years. Regular marks carved into bone or antler, sometimes in sequences that suggest counting or record-keeping. The Lubombo bone from South Africa has 29 notches and is about 44,000 years old. The Ishango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo has more complex patterns and is between 20 and 25,000 years old. Are these writing? Most archaeologists would say no. They're probably tallies, counting marks, memory aids, but they're also external symbols being used to encode information. They're a step toward writing, a recognition that marks on objects can represent abstract concepts like quantity. And then there are the cave paintings. Some of the most famous, Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, Chauvet Cave in France, date back between 15 and 35,000 years. These are not crude stick figures. These are sophisticated representations of animals, rendered with remarkable skill and understanding of perspective, movement, anatomy. Horses, bison, lions, rhinoceros, mammoths. All painted on cave walls, in chambers that were deliberately chosen, deliberately accessed, decorated as part of what must have been significant cultural practices. But they're not writing. They're representational art. They show things, but they don't encode language. You can't read a cave painting the way you read a sentence. You can look at it, interpret it, appreciate it, but it's not a system of symbols that corresponds to spoken words in a structured way. That's what separates writing from other forms of symbolic representation. Writing is a system of visual symbols that encode language. It allows you to transform the temporal, ephemeral nature of speech into something permanent and spatial. It allows someone who wasn't there when you spoke to access your words later. It allows communication across time. The earliest true writing systems we know of emerged around 3020 BC in Mesopotamia, in what's now southern Iraq. Cuneiform script, pressed into clay tablets with reed styluses, initially used for accounting, recording quantities of grain, numbers of animals, transactions between parties. It was fundamentally a record-keeping technology, a way for increasingly complex societies to track resources and obligations. Around the same time, or possibly slightly earlier, Egyptian hieroglyphics emerged. Again, initially for record-keeping and monumental inscriptions, marking tombs in temples and proclamations of royal power. Both systems started relatively simple, pictographic symbols representing objects or concepts, and gradually became more abstract, developing phonetic elements that allowed them to represent sounds, which allowed them to represent any word in the spoken language. Later, other writing systems emerged independently. Chinese characters probably developed around 1200 BCE based on earlier proto-writing that might go back further. Mayan glyphs developed around 300 BCE, and various other systems across the world Some independently invented, some borrowed and adapted from neighbors. But 5,000 years ago, that's when writing, as we understand it, becomes clearly visible in the archaeological record. Everything before that is prehistory. 200,000 years of modern human existence, and we have writing for only the most recent 5,000. What this means is that the vast majority of human cultural and intellectual development happened without permanent records. Language, obviously, is much older than writing. Modern humans had fully developed language capacity, the same cognitive and physical apparatus that allows us to speak, by at least 70,000 years ago, probably much earlier. Some researchers argue that fully modern language capacity existed as far back as 200,000 years ago. So for somewhere between 65,000 and 200,000 years, humans had language. Complex, sophisticated language capable of expressing abstract thoughts, hypothetical scenarios, past and future events, emotions, beliefs, instructions, stories. All of it flowing through the air is sound, received by ears, processed by brains, responded to in turn, but none of it permanent. Think about what that means for accumulating knowledge. If you discover something useful, a new technique for making stone tools, a better way to track game, an observation about which plants are poisonous and which are medicinal, you can share it with your group through demonstration and explanation. They can learn it, practice it, use it, and they can teach it to their children. But the transmission is imperfect. Human memory is fallible. Details get lost or distorted. And if the knowledge isn't being actively used, if circumstances change and it's no longer relevant, it can be forgotten within a generation or two. There's no reference book to consult, no archived manual. If knowledge isn't being actively maintained in someone's living memory, it disappears. This creates a kind of fragility. Oral cultures can maintain remarkable amounts of information across many generations. We see this in societies that developed elaborate oral traditions, using mnemonic devices, songs, stories, ritual repetition to encode knowledge. But it requires continuous effort. It requires people dedicated to remembering, and it's vulnerable to disruption, disaster, disease, war, migration. Anything that kills or scatters the knowledge keepers can break the chain of transmission. There's evidence that this happened repeatedly in human history. Technologies that appeared, were used for a while, then vanished for thousands of years before being reinvented. The bow and arrow, for example, appears in the archaeological record in Africa around 64,000 years ago, then disappears, then reappears later. Did the knowledge of how to make bows get lost and have to be rediscovered? Or did circumstances change, making bows less useful, so people stopped making them and the knowledge atrophied? We don't know. Without written records explaining what people were thinking and why they made the choices they made, we're left guessing based on material remains. But we do know that oral cultures can preserve sophisticated knowledge over very long periods. Aboriginal Australian cultures have oral traditions that appear to encode memories of specific events from over 10,000 years ago. Stories about landscapes that were transformed when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, turning hills into islands, flooding valleys, changing coastlines. These stories have been passed down through hundreds of generations, maintaining enough accuracy that modern researchers can identify the real geographic features and events they describe. Similarly, some researchers argue that certain fairy tales and myths might preserve memories of much older events or cultural practices. The story of the Great Flood appears in multiple ancient cultures: Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu, and might preserve memories of actual flooding events at the end of the Ice Age, when glacial lakes burst and sea levels rose dramatically. But these are exceptions. Stories that were important enough, emotionally resonant enough, tied to significant enough events to be maintained across immense spans of time. Most day-to-day knowledge, most ordinary observations, most individual experiences were never preserved at all. They lived and died with the people who experienced them. And this is the fundamental loss of prehistory. Not just that we don't have records, though that's true, but that most of human experience was always destined to be unrecorded, because the technology to record it didn't exist. People lived full, complex lives. They had knowledge we would find valuable. They made observations about the natural world, about human behavior, about how to live well, and almost all of it is gone. What we're left with is material culture, the physical objects that survived. And these objects are biased. They're biased toward durability. Stone survives better than wood, bone better than leather, ceramic better than organic materials. They're biased toward visibility. We find things that are large, distinctive, or buried in conditions that preserve them. They're biased toward certain types of activity. Hunting tools are more visible than gathering tools. Men's work is often more archaeologically visible than women's work. So when we try to reconstruct life before writing, we're working with a fragmentary, biased sample of material remains and trying to infer from that what people's lives were actually like. It's like trying to understand modern civilization 1,000 years from now, based solely on what survives in landfills. You'd get a very distorted picture. You'd miss most of what mattered to people. You'd miss their thoughts, their beliefs, their relationships, their inner lives. That's where we are with prehistory, looking at the trash basically, and trying to reconstruct the full richness of human existence from those fragments. Let's talk about what we actually know. Not speculation, not inference, but things we can be relatively confident about, based on physical evidence. We know that anatomically modern humans emerged in Africa somewhere around 200 to 300,000 years ago. The earliest fossils we found that look essentially like us, same skull shape, same skeletal proportions, date to this period. These weren't the first hominins, obviously. There's a long lineage going back millions of years. But these were people who, if you dressed them in modern clothes, could walk down a street today and not look out of place. We know that by 70,000 years ago, and probably much earlier, these humans had symbolic culture. They were making jewelry, beads from shells, pendants from bone. They were using pigments, grinding ochre into powder and mixing it with liquids to create paint. They were engraving patterns onto objects. All of this suggests abstract thought, the ability to create and recognize symbols, to find meaning in objects beyond their practical utility. We know that humans spread out of Africa in multiple waves, starting at least 100,000 years ago and continuing in pulses after that. By 40,000 years ago, humans had reached Australia, which required sophisticated boat building and navigation across open ocean. By 35,000 years ago, humans were in Europe. By 15,000 years ago, they'd crossed into the Americas. Within a geologically brief period, humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. We know that wherever humans went, they adapted to local conditions. They developed different tool technologies appropriate to different environments. They hunted different animals, gathered different plants, created different cultural practices. Arctic peoples developed technologies for surviving in extreme cold. Pacific Islanders developed sophisticated navigation techniques for traveling between islands. Desert peoples developed knowledge of water sources and heat management. This adaptability, this ability to figure out how to live in wildly different environments, is distinctly human. We know that by at least 40,000 years ago, humans were creating sophisticated art, not just decorative marks, but representational art that demonstrates careful observation of the natural world and technical skill in rendering it. The cave paintings in France and Spain are the most famous, but similar art appears across Europe, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. People were painting, carving, sculpting. They were creating images that weren't functionally necessary, but that clearly mattered to them. We know that humans buried their dead, and that they did so with apparent care and ritual. Graves from as far back as 100,000 years ago show bodies placed in deliberate positions, sometimes with grave goods, tools, ornaments, food. This suggests belief in some kind of afterlife, or at least a recognition that the dead deserved special treatment. It suggests emotional bonds, grief, perhaps concepts of personhood that extended beyond biological life. We know that humans developed increasingly sophisticated tool technologies over time. The general trajectory is from simple stone tools, choppers and hand axes, to more complex forms, blades, points, hafted tools with stone parts attached to wooden or bone handles, to eventually composite tools made from multiple materials. There's also evidence of regional variation and innovation, with different groups developing different approaches to solving similar problems. We know that by at least 30,000 years ago, and probably much earlier, humans had sophisticated knowledge of the natural world. They understood animal behavior well enough to hunt effectively, sometimes coordinating to drive herds of animals off cliffs or into ambush sites. They understood plant cycles well enough to know when and where to gather different foods. They understood materials well enough to select the right type of stone for different tools, the right wood for different purposes. We know that humans engaged in long-distance trade or exchange. Obsidian, a volcanic glass useful for making sharp tools, appears at sites hundreds of kilometers from the nearest volcano. Shells from coastal areas appear at inland sites. This suggests either direct travel over long distances, or more likely, exchange networks where materials were passed from group to group across regions. We know that humans developed music and possibly dance. Bone flutes dating back 40,000 years have been found in Europe. Rhythmic patterns in some cave paintings might indicate connection to music or dance. And of course, all human cultures we know of have music and dance as part of their cultural practices, suggesting deep roots. These are things we can be confident about, but notice what's missing from this list. We don't know what languages they spoke. We don't know what stories they told. We don't know what they believed about the cosmos, about death, about the purpose of existence. We don't know their names. We don't know their personal histories. We don't know what made them laugh or cry. We don't know what they dreamed about. All of that, the internal, subjective dimension of human life, is invisible to us. We can infer that it existed. People with brains like ours, living in social groups, facing the challenges of survival and cooperation, must have had rich inner lives. Must have wondered about things, believed things, feared things, hoped for things. But we can't access it directly. What we're looking at is the material shadow of culture, the physical traces left behind by people who lived complex lives but left no written testimony. And we are trying to reconstruct the full three-dimensional reality from that shadow. Sometimes we get lucky. Sometimes preservation is unusually good. The famous Iceman, found in the Alps in 1991, dated to about 5,300 years ago, right at the edge of written history in some regions, but still prehistoric in the Alps, gives us an incredibly detailed snapshot of one person's life. We have his clothes, his tools, his weapons, his food, even the contents of his stomach. We can see that he had tattoos. We can analyze his DNA. We can determine that he died violently, with an arrow wound in his shoulder. But even with all that detail, we don't know his name. We don't know what language he spoke. We don't know what he believed. We don't know where he was going or why. We don't know if he had family, what role he played in his community, what he was thinking in his final moments. The material evidence is extraordinarily rich, but the personal, subjective dimension remains out of reach. This is the frustration of studying prehistory. The evidence we have is real and valuable. It tells us genuine things about how people lived. But it leaves enormous gaps. And those gaps are precisely where the things we most want to know would be located. There's a thought experiment that might help illuminate this problem. Imagine that some catastrophe happens today, not one that destroys all humans, but one that destroys all written and digital records. Every book burns, every hard drive corrupts. Every piece of paper with writing on it disintegrates, but people survive. The physical infrastructure remains. Buildings, roads, artifacts, all intact. Just the records gone. Now imagine that 1,000 years later, archaeologists are trying to reconstruct our civilization. What would they find? Buildings, obviously, lots of them. They could map out cities, see patterns of settlement, identify different types of structures. They'd find artifacts, tools, vehicles, household objects, art. They could analyze all of this and learn quite a bit about how we lived materially. But what would they miss? They'd have no books, so no access to our literature, our philosophy, our accumulated knowledge of science and history. They'd have no records, so no understanding of political structures, economic systems, legal frameworks. They'd have artifacts from religions, churches, temples, ritual objects, but no access to religious texts, so no way to understand the actual beliefs and doctrines. They might find musical instruments but no sheet music, art but no artist statements, scientific equipment but no lab notes or published papers, monuments but no explanation of what they commemorate or why they were built. They'd be in a position similar to ours with prehistory, able to see that there was a complex civilization, able to identify certain patterns and technologies, but fundamentally End of Life and Pride by Jerry Swanton. They'd know we existed and that we did certain things, but they wouldn't really understand us. Now imagine that instead of 1,000 years, it's 10,000 years, or 100,000. How much would survive? Buildings would crumble, metals would corrode, plastics would break down. Eventually, almost everything would return to dust. Future archaeologists might find fragments of ceramics, some stone structures if we built any, possibly some glass. They might find layers of disturbed earth, indicating past settlement. They might find chemical signatures in the soil suggesting industrial activity. But they wouldn't find us. Not really. Not our thoughts, our words, our ideas, ourselves. All of that would be gone, erased by time, and the absence of permanent records that could survive millennia. This is the position we're in when we look at prehistory. We're the archaeologists 10,000 years after the fact, trying to understand people who left no records and whose physical traces are fragmentary at best. And it gets worse. Because at least in our thought experiment, the archaeologists would be working with relatively recent remains. 1,000 or 10,000 years is a long time, but it's not unimaginable. We have historical records from civilizations that old. We can conceptualize it. But with deep prehistory, we're talking about timescales that are difficult to comprehend. 100,000 years, 200,000 years. These aren't just long periods. They're spans of time that contain hundreds or thousands of generations. Time enough for entire cultures to rise and fall, for knowledge to be gained and lost, and gained again, for languages to evolve into mutual incomprehensibility. And we're trying to understand all of that, with essentially no written testimony, and only the most durable material remains. It's an absurdly difficult task. It's like trying to watch a movie where 99% of the frames are missing, and the ones that remain are blurry and damaged. You can see that something is happening. You can identify certain patterns, but you're missing most of the story. This is why prehistory is so full of debates and disagreements. With so little evidence and so much missing, interpretation becomes crucial. The same artifacts can be explained in multiple ways. Cave paintings could be religious art, hunting magic, shamanic visions, decorative expression, or something else entirely. Burial practices could indicate belief in an afterlife, respect for the dead, disease control, or social display. Stone tool variations could represent different cultures, different functions, different time periods, or individual variation. Archaeologists argue about all of this constantly, because the evidence rarely speaks unambiguously. We're always inferring, always making educated guesses, always aware that we might be wrong, because we're missing so much context. The Devil's Red Side and Red Sea were all rattled.
And the further back we go, the worse it gets. The evidence becomes more fragmentary.
The time scales become more compressed. It's hard to distinguish between events that were 1,000 years apart when you're working with dating methods that have margins of error of several thousand years. Cultural variation becomes harder to identify when you have so few artifacts to work with. By the time you're back beyond 100,000 years, you're working with scraps, scattered stone tools, occasional bones, rare sites with good preservation. And from that, you're supposed to reconstruct the lives and minds of people who were cognitively modern, who had language and culture, and all the complexity that implies, but who left almost nothing behind that we can interpret with confidence. It's humbling. It forces you to accept that most of human history is simply unknowable with current methods and evidence. We can know that it happened, we can know some broad patterns, but the details, the texture, the lived experience, that's lost. Let's focus on one specific question that illustrates the challenges of prehistory. When did humans develop language? This seems like a straightforward question. Language is fundamental to human culture. It's how we communicate complex ideas, coordinate activities, pass on knowledge. It's arguably what makes us uniquely human in terms of our cultural capabilities. So when did we get it? The problem is that language doesn't fossilize. It leaves no direct traces in the archaeological record. We can't dig up ancient conversations. We can't find preserved examples of prehistoric speech. Language is ephemeral, existing only as sound waves that dissipate immediately. So instead, we have to look for indirect evidence, things that suggest linguistic capacity, even though they don't directly demonstrate it. One approach is anatomical. Modern humans have specific physical features that support speech. A descended larynx, which creates space for manipulating sounds. A hyoid bone, positioned to support the complex muscle movements needed for articulate speech. A specific shape to the vocal tract. Neural wiring in the brain dedicated to language processing and production. Some of these features can be inferred from fossils. The hyoid bone occasionally preserves. The shape of the skull can tell us something about brain structure and the position of the larynx. By examining hominin fossils, we can get some sense of when the physical capacity for modern speech might have emerged. The current consensus is that anatomically modern humans had the physical equipment for speech at least 100,000 years ago, probably longer. The descended larynx and appropriate brain structures appear to be present in all anatomically modern human fossils. Some researchers argue that even earlier hominins, Neanderthals, Homo heidelbergensis, had the physical capacity for speech, though perhaps not as refined as ours. But having the physical capacity for speech doesn't necessarily mean having language. Parrots can produce complex sounds, but don't have language in the human sense. The question is whether the brain was wired for the cognitive aspects of language, grammar, syntax, the ability to combine symbols recursively to create unlimited novel expressions. This is harder to determine from fossils. We can see that brain size increased over hominin evolution. We can see that certain areas of the brain associated with language in modern humans expanded. But we can't directly observe cognitive function from a fossil skull. So researchers look for indirect evidence, archaeological signatures that suggest cognitive capabilities that would require or at least strongly benefit from language. Complex tool-making is one such signature. Making a sophisticated stone tool, especially composite tools with multiple parts, or tools that require multiple steps and specific techniques, requires learning. You can learn by observation and imitation, but language makes it much easier. Being able to explain techniques verbally, to correct errors, to discuss why certain methods work, this would dramatically speed up skill transmission. The fact that we see increasingly complex tools appearing in the archaeological record over time suggests increasing cognitive sophistication. And by around 300,000 years ago, we see tools sophisticated enough that, and most researchers think their manufacture must have involved linguistic instruction. Symbolic behavior is another signature. The use of pigments, the creation of ornaments, the making of representational art. These suggest abstract thought, the ability to imbue objects with meaning beyond their practical function. And symbolic thought is closely tied to language, which is itself a symbolic system. Evidence of symbolic behavior appears at least 100,000 years ago, with the shell beads and engraved ochre from African sites. It becomes more common and widespread after 70,000 years ago, and it explodes after 40,000 years ago, with the cave paintings and carved figurines of the European Upper Paleolithic. Long-distance exchange is another signature. Trading or exchanging materials over hundreds of kilometers requires social networks, relationships between groups, probably some form of agreement or reciprocity. Language would make this much easier, allowing negotiation, the establishment of trade partnerships, the transmission of information about distant groups. And finally, there's the sheer fact of human expansion and adaptation. The ability of humans to spread across the world and adapt to wildly different environments requires cultural transmission of knowledge. You need to know what foods are safe, what materials are available, how to make appropriate shelter, how to deal with local dangers. All of this knowledge would be much more effectively transmitted with language. Putting all this together, most researchers think that fully modern language, with complex grammar, lard mainly paying, righteous content, in ways in humans by at least 70,000 years ago. Many think it was present much earlier, possibly as far back as 200,000 years ago, or even earlier, but we can't be certain. We can't definitively prove that people 100,000 years ago had language exactly like ours. We can't rule out the possibility that language evolved gradually, becoming more complex over time, even within anatomically modern humans. We can't exclude scenarios where different hominin populations had different levels of linguistic capability. This uncertainty extends to other questions too. When did humans develop music? When did religious belief emerge? When did we start having concepts of personal identity that persist after death? When did we develop the ability to plan for the distant future or to reflect on the distant past? All of these are cognitive capabilities that leave, at best, indirect traces. We can see evidence that suggests they existed. Burial practices that might indicate religious belief, decorated objects that might indicate music or dance, evidence of food storage that indicates future planning. But we can't definitively say when these capabilities emerged or how they evolved. What we're left with is a picture of gradual emergence of modern human cognition over a long period, with the physical capacity for language and symbolic thought present in anatomically modern humans from the beginning, but the full elaboration of cultural capabilities developing over tens of thousands of years. But again, without written records, we're inferring all of this from fragmentary material evidence. We're building models and hypotheses that fit the data we have, but we're always aware that new discoveries could force revisions. We're always aware of how much we don't know. There's something deeply strange about the pace of change in prehistory. If you look at the archaeological record, you see long periods of apparent stasis, punctuated by relatively rapid changes. For example, the stone tool technology called the Acheulean, characterized by bifacial hand axes and cleavers, appears about 1.7 million years ago. And it persists, with relatively little change, for over a million years. A million years. That's hundreds of thousands of generations of hominins making essentially the same tools in essentially the same way. Then, around 300,000 years ago, new technologies start appearing. More varied tool types, more sophisticated manufacturing techniques, evidence of hafting, attaching stone points to wooden shafts. The pace of innovation starts to accelerate. And then, around 50,000 years ago, there's what some researchers call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, or the Great Leap Forward. Suddenly, in geological terms, we see an explosion of innovation. New tool types, bone and antler tools, needles for selling, cave art, sculpture, musical instruments, elaborate burials, evidence of fishing, evidence of long-distance trade, all appearing in the archaeological record within a relatively short time span. What happened? Why the long stasis followed by rapid change? There are several theories, none of them fully satisfying. One possibility is that the appearance of rapid change is partly an illusion created by the nature of the archaeological record. Older sites are rarer and more degraded. Subtle changes in tool types or behaviors might not preserve or might not be distinguishable with current methods. So what looks like stasis might actually be gradual change that we can't resolve. Another possibility is that the changes are real and represent cognitive or cultural revolutions. Maybe something changed in human cognition around 50,000 years ago, a genetic mutation affecting brain wiring, or the emergence of fully modern language, or some other cognitive leap. This would explain why humans suddenly became more innovative, more culturally productive, more capable of complex symbolic behavior. But this seems unlikely, given that anatomically modern humans existed for well over 100,000 years before the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Why would it take so long for cognitive capabilities to be expressed in the archaeological record? A third possibility is that the changes are real but represent cultural rather than cognitive evolution. Maybe humans had the cognitive capacity all along, but it took time for cultures to develop the specific innovations and for populations to reach sizes and densities where innovation could accumulate and spread. This is plausible. Innovation in small, isolated populations can easily be lost. If one person figures out a new technique but dies before fully transmitting it, the innovation disappears. But in larger, more connected populations, innovations are more likely to spread and be maintained. And population density and connectivity increased over time, especially after 50,000 years ago, which could explain the acceleration of cultural change. There's also the possibility of environmental triggers. Climate change, resource availability, competition with other hominin groups like Neanderthals, all of these could have driven cultural innovation. When conditions are stable, there's less pressure to innovate. When conditions change, necessity drives invention. The truth is probably some combination of all these factors. Gradual cognitive evolution providing the capacity, population dynamics creating conditions where innovation could accumulate, environmental pressures driving specific adaptations, cultural evolution building on previous innovations in a way that accelerates over time. But the fundamental point is that for most of prehistory, change was incredibly slow compared to what we're used to. A stone tool type that remained essentially unchanged for 1,000,000 years. Cultural practices that persisted for tens of thousands of years. This is radically different from our experience of rapid technological and cultural change, and it's hard to comprehend. We live in a world where significant changes happen within a human lifetime, where technologies that didn't exist when we were children are ubiquitous by the time we're adults, where cultural norms shift noticeably within decades. But for most of human existence, that wasn't the case. You could expect to live your entire life using essentially the same tools as your great-great-great-great-grandparents, the same techniques, the same practices. Change happened so slowly that it was imperceptible within an individual lifetime, or even across many generations. This has implications for how we think about prehistory. We can't project our experience of rapid change back onto the past. We have to imagine a world where tradition was everything, where doing things the way they'd always been done made perfect sense, because it had worked for longer than anyone could remember. Innovation happened, but it was rare. Most people, most of the time, were maintaining existing knowledge rather than creating new knowledge. And without writing to record innovations, each generation had to learn anew from the previous generation, which meant that transmission had to be reliable, which meant that deviation from established practice was risky. This is one of the fundamental differences that writing introduces. Writing allows innovation to be recorded and preserved, even if it's not immediately useful. It allows rare insights to be saved for later consultation. It allows knowledge to accumulate across generations without requiring continuous chains of living transmission. Before writing, knowledge was more conservative, more tied to immediate practical needs, more vulnerable to loss. People could be incredibly intelligent and observant, but their observations died with them unless they were successfully transmitted orally. And oral transmission favors information that's memorable, that fits into cultural narratives, that's immediately useful. Idiosyncratic insights, abstract theories, speculative ideas, these are harder to preserve orally and more likely to be lost. So, the world before writing was a world where knowledge accumulation was slow and vulnerable, where innovation happened but often failed to spread or persist, where human cognitive capacity was present but not fully utilized because the tools to amplify and preserve thought didn't exist yet. Let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention when we discuss prehistory: the emotional and psychological experience of living before writing. We tend to focus on material conditions, what people ate, how they made tools, where they lived. But people in prehistory had the same basic emotional and cognitive capacities we have. They felt joy and sorrow. They experienced anxiety and relief. They formed attachments and grieved losses. They wondered about things and felt curiosity. They had a sense of self and a sense of their place in a social group and in the larger world. What was it like to be a human in that world? A world without writing, without permanent records, without the ability to access knowledge from the distant past, or to send messages to the distant future. For one thing, it was a world where memory was everything. If you wanted to know something, how to make a certain tool, where the best hunting grounds were, which plants were medicinal, what the stars meant, what the stories of your ancestors were, you had to remember it or know someone who remembered it. This places enormous importance on elders. In oral cultures, old people are repositories of knowledge. They've lived long enough to accumulate experiences, to remember events from decades ago, to know things that younger people haven't learned yet. Respecting elders isn't just a moral choice, it's practical survival. They hold knowledge that the community needs, and it places importance on teaching and learning. Children have to be actively taught everything they need to know to survive and function in their culture. Nothing is written down in a manual they can consult later. Everything has to be demonstrated, explained, practiced, remembered. This also means that personal identity is different. In a literate culture, you can define yourself partly through writing, through the things you've written, through your records and documents, through external markers of your existence that persist after you die. In an oral culture, your identity is more relational. You're defined by your relationships to other people, by your role in the community, by the living memory others have of you. When you die in an oral culture, you persist only as long as people remember you. Your deeds, your words, your personality, all of it exists only in the memories of those who knew you. And when they die, unless they've successfully transmitted your memory to others, you're forgotten, completely, as if you never existed. This creates a different relationship with mortality. Death is not just the end of your biological life, it's potentially the end of your existence in any form. The only immortality available is to do something memorable enough that people will tell stories about you, stories that get passed down across generations. This might explain why heroic deeds and dramatic events feature so prominently in oral traditions. They're memorable. They're the kinds of stories that people want to tell and retell. Ordinary life, mundane achievements, quiet virtues, these are harder to preserve orally. They're not dramatic enough to stick in memory across generations. So the world before writing might have felt more ephemeral, more focused on the present moment and the living community. The past existed only in memory and was always in danger of being forgotten. The future existed only as imagination and couldn't be directly influenced, except through children and oral transmission. There was also no ability to communicate across distances except through physical travel or chains of oral transmission. If you wanted to send a message to someone far away, you had to either go yourself or send someone you trusted to carry the message verbally, and you had to trust that the message wouldn't be distorted in transmission. This made the world smaller in some ways. Your practical world, the world you could meaningfully interact with, was limited to the people you could physically reach and the people they could reach. Information traveled at the speed of human movement, which was slow. But in other ways, it might have made the world feel larger and more mysterious. Beyond your immediate group and the groups you had direct contact with, the world was largely unknown. There were no maps, or at least no permanent maps. There were no written accounts of distant places. Everything you knew about the wider world came from stories, from travelers, from oral reports that might or might not be accurate. This meant that distant places could be mythologized, could take on qualities of legend and mystery. The boundary between the known world and the mythical world was blurry. Strange creatures, magical places, heroic ancestors, all of it existed in the same oral tradition without clear demarcation between what was factual history and what was explanatory myth. And there was no way to check, no written records to consult, no authoritative sources to verify claims against. Knowledge was plural. Different people had different versions of stories, different understandings of the world, and there was no objective way to determine which was correct. This might have created a more fluid sense of truth. In oral cultures, truth is often more about consensus and social agreement than about correspondence with objective reality. If the community agrees that something is true, if it functions as truth in their cultural practice, then it is true in the way that matters. This is alien to literate cultures, especially modern scientific cultures, where we have strong notions of objective truth that exists independent of belief or agreement. But in oral cultures, the distinction between factual truth and mythical truth might have been less sharp. What mattered was whether the knowledge was useful, whether it helped the community function, whether it answered the questions people cared about. All of this is speculation, of course. We can't know what it felt like to be a person in prehistory. We can only infer from what we know about oral cultures that persisted into the historical period, and from our understanding of human psychology and cognition. But it's worth trying to imagine, because these were real people with real experiences. They weren't primitive in terms of their cognitive capacity or emotional depth. They were us, just living in different circumstances, with different tools and different cultural frameworks. And in some ways, they might have been wiser than us about certain things, about the importance of community and face-to-face relationships, about living in balance with the natural environment, about the value of tradition and accumulated wisdom, about the significance of storytelling and the power of shared narrative. We've gained enormous capabilities through writing and subsequent technologies, but we've also lost things. We've lost the necessity of remembering. We've lost the intimacy of purely oral transmission. We've lost the cultural unity that comes from shared stories everyone in the community knows. Whether the trade-off was worth it is not a question with a simple answer. We've gained the ability to accumulate knowledge across vast spans of time, to communicate across vast distances, to preserve the thoughts of the dead for the benefit of the living. These are extraordinary capabilities. But we've also created a world where memory is externalized and therefore devalued, where human relationships are mediated through text rather than presence, where the volume of recorded information is so vast that most of it will never be read, rendering it effectively as lost as unwritten knowledge. The world before writing had different problems and different advantages. It's worth understanding both if we want to fully appreciate what writing has given us and what it's cost us. There's a category of prehistoric site that deserves special attention because it reveals something profound about pre-literate cognition: megalithic monuments. These are structures built from massive stones, megaliths, often arranged in specific patterns or used to create chambers, circles, or alignments. They appear across the world: Stonehenge and Avebury in England, Newgrange in Ireland, Karnak in France, the dolmens of Korea, the Moai platforms of Easter Island, and many others. These monuments are remarkable for several reasons. First, they require enormous labor, moving stones weighing tens of tons, sometimes over 100 tons. Without modern machinery requires sophisticated knowledge of physics, careful planning, and the coordination of many people. These aren't simple projects. They're major communal undertakings that would have consumed significant resources. Second, they're often aligned with astronomical phenomena. Stonehenge's main axis aligns with the summer solstice sunrise. Newgrange's passage is oriented so that sunlight penetrates deep into the chamber only at winter solstice. Many megalithic sites show careful attention to celestial movements: the sun, moon, and stars. This demonstrates sophisticated astronomical knowledge. These weren't random arrangements. People were making careful observations of the sky, tracking patterns over long periods, and encoding that knowledge in permanent stone monuments. Third, many megalithic sites appear to have been used over very long periods, hundreds or even thousands of years. Stonehenge was built in multiple phases, spanning from around 3000 BCE to 160 BCE. That's 1,400 years of continuous use and modification. Newgrange was built around 3020 BCE and remained significant for millennia. This means that these monuments represented something important enough to maintain across dozens or hundreds of generations. People who built the initial structures died long before the monuments were completed. People who completed them died long before they were finished being used. These were truly multi-generational projects requiring sustained cultural commitment. But here's what's fascinating. We have no written records explaining why they were built or what they meant. Stonehenge predates writing in Britain by thousands of years. Even when writing did arrive, the people using Stonehenge probably didn't write about it, or if they did, those records haven't survived. So we're left inferring purpose from structure and context. The astronomical alignments suggest calendrical or ritual functions. The burial remains found at some sites suggest connections to death and ancestry. The monumental scale suggests communal significance, probably religious or ceremonial. But the specific beliefs, the exact rituals, the stories told about these places, all of that is lost. We're looking at architectural texts written in stone, but we can't read them. We can see that they're meaningful, but we can't access the meaning. This is frustrating but also illuminating, because it shows us that pre-literate peoples were capable of creating structures that required sophisticated knowledge, long-term planning, and sustained collective effort. They were capable of encoding astronomical observations in permanent form. They were capable of creating monuments that would outlast any individual, any generation, any language or culture. What they couldn't do, or at least didn't do, in ways that survived, was explain their work in their own words. They couldn't leave written manuals describing their techniques. They couldn't leave theological treatises explaining their beliefs. They couldn't leave histories describing who built what, and when, and why. So we have these extraordinary monuments, clear evidence of complex thought and sophisticated knowledge, but very limited understanding of the minds that created them. And this pattern repeats across prehistory. We see evidence of impressive capabilities, long-distance trade networks, complex tool technologies, artistic achievements, but limited access to the knowledge systems and cultural meanings that made them possible. It's like finding a complex machine and being able to see how it's assembled, but not why it was built or how it was supposed to be used. The physical object is there, the evidence of intelligence is there, but the context, the explanation, the human meaning, that's missing. This is the essential problem of prehistory. Material sophistication without textual explanation. Evidence of complex minds without access to the content of this public method, praise. Artifacts without accompanying interpretation from the people who made them. We can learn a lot from careful analysis of these materials. Modern archaeology has developed sophisticated methods for extracting information from physical remains. But there's a limit. Without writing, without direct testimony from the people who lived these lives, we're always working with incomplete information. And the further back we go, the more incomplete it becomes. The megalithic monuments at least give us something substantial to study, but most of prehistory left even less. Scattered stone tools, occasional bones, rare sites with good preservation. From that fragmentary record, we're supposed to reconstruct hundreds of thousands of years of human experience. It's an impossible task, really. But we try anyway. Because the alternative is to accept that most of human history is simply unknowable, that the vast majority of human experiences and thoughts and cultures are lost forever. That's hard to accept. So we keep looking, keep excavating, keep analyzing, keep trying to coax meaning from stones and bones and the faint traces of lives lived long ago. Let's address something that often gets overlooked in discussions of prehistory: the diversity of human experience during this period. When we say prehistory, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years across all continents. That's not a single period or a single culture. It's thousands of different cultures, thousands of different adaptations to different environments, thousands of different solutions to the problem of how to live as humans in the world. Arctic peoples developed completely different technologies and cultural practices than tropical peoples. Desert dwellers had different knowledge than coastal peoples. Groups in resource-rich environments could be more sedentary, while groups in resource-poor environments had to be more mobile. And this diversity wasn't static. Cultures changed over time. They adapted to changing climates, changing resources, changing social conditions. They borrowed from neighbors. They developed new technologies. They forgot old ones. The human cultural landscape before writing was probably as varied and dynamic as it has been in historical times. But we tend to flatten it. We talk about hunter-gatherers as if that's a single category of people with a single way of life. But the term covers enormous variation. Some hunter-gatherers lived in permanent or semi-permanent villages. Others were highly mobile. Some had complex social hierarchies. Others were egalitarian. Some relied heavily on hunting, others on fishing or gathering. Some had rich material cultures with elaborate art and ceremony. Others left minimal archaeological traces. The archaeological record gives us glimpses of this diversity, but only glimpses. We can see regional variations in stone tool types. We can see different subsistence strategies in different environments. We can see different burial practices, different art styles, different settlement patterns. But we're missing the cultural and linguistic diversity that must have existed. Languages diversify rapidly in the absence of widespread literacy. Isolated groups develop distinct languages within hundreds or thousands of years. Over the hundreds of thousands of years of human prehistory, there must have been thousands of languages, each with its own way of categorizing the world, its own concepts and metaphors, its own oral traditions. All lost. We don't know a single word of any language spoken more than 5,000 years ago, unless it was written down. The entire linguistic diversity of prehistory, all those ways of thinking and speaking and categorizing experience, gone. And with language goes so much culture, because culture is transmitted largely through language. The stories you tell, the explanations you give, the values you express, the categories you use to organize experience. All of this is embedded in language and transmitted orally in pre-literate societies. When a language dies without being recorded, its entire cultural universe dies with it. The unique way that languages speakers understood the world, the specific knowledge they encoded in their vocabulary and grammar, the stories and songs and explanations they created, all of it becomes inaccessible. This has been happening throughout prehistory. Languages emerging, diversifying, dying, being replaced over and over for hundreds of thousands of years, each one representing a unique human culture, a unique way of being human in the world. And almost none of it preserved. We're left with the material remains, which are much more limited in what they can tell us about cultural diversity. A stone tool can tell us something about technology and subsistence strategy, but it tells us almost nothing about language, belief, social organization, or cultural values. So, when we study prehistory, we're studying a radically simplified version of what was actually a complex, diverse, ever-changing cultural landscape. We're seeing the outlines, but missing most of the detail. We're seeing patterns that emerge across multiple cultures, but missing the unique characteristics that made each culture distinct. This should make us humble, because what we don't know about prehistory vastly exceeds what we do know. The gaps in our knowledge aren't small holes in an otherwise complete picture. They're vast expanses of missing information with occasional islands of evidence. And it should make us appreciate the incredible loss that pre-literacy represents. Not just for us trying to understand the past, but for the people of the past themselves. Because without writing, each culture was largely isolated from other cultures temporarily. They couldn't learn from the distant past because they had no access to it except through degraded oral tradition. They couldn't contribute to the distant future because they had no way to send messages forward in time except through oral transmission, which is unreliable over long periods. Each generation had to learn most things anew from the previous generation. They could build on that learning, make incremental improvements, but they couldn't easily access innovations from earlier times or from distant places. Knowledge was local, recent, and vulnerable to loss. This made human cultural evolution much slower than it could have been. Innovation happened, but it often failed to spread or persist. Insights were gained and then forgotten. Sophisticated knowledge was developed and then lost when the people who held it died without successfully transmitting it. Writing changed this fundamentally. It allowed knowledge to persist without continuous chains of oral transmission. It allowed innovations to be recorded and accessed by people who never met the innovators. It allowed cultural knowledge to accumulate across generations in ways that oral tradition couldn't match. But before writing, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans were culturally creative and cognitively sophisticated, but limited in their ability to build on the past or contribute to the future. They lived in an eternal present, anchored by tradition and memory, but without access to the deep past or the distant future. There's a question that haunts anyone who thinks seriously about prehistory. How much have we lost? How much knowledge, how many insights, how many ways of understanding the world existed in pre-literate cultures and are now completely inaccessible to us? We know that modern hunter-gatherer and other pre-literate societies possess sophisticated knowledge about their environments. They know which plants are medicinal and which are poisonous. They understand animal behavior in detail. They can navigate using environmental cues. They have developed sustainable resource management practices. They have complex social organizations and effective conflict resolution mechanisms. This knowledge is real and valuable, and it was developed without writing, transmitted orally across generations, maintained through practice and teaching. But most of it is invisible to archaeology. We can't excavate knowledge of plant properties or animal behavior or social norms. We can only see the material results, evidence of plant use, bones from hunted animals, settlement patterns that might reflect social organization. So we're missing most of what pre-literate peoples knew, their accumulated observations about the natural world, their practical wisdom about living in their specific environments, their psychological insights about human behavior and social dynamics, their philosophical and religious ideas about the nature of existence. Some of this can be partially reconstructed by studying contemporary pre-literate societies. By observing how they live, what they know, how they transmit knowledge, we can make inferences about how prehistoric peoples might have lived. But this is problematic for several reasons. First, contemporary pre-literate societies aren't living fossils frozen in time. They've evolved and adapted just like everyone else. They've had thousands of years of history since the prehistoric periods we're trying to understand. Their current practices and knowledge aren't necessarily representative of what existed tens of thousands of years ago. Second, contemporary pre-literate societies exist in a world that includes literate societies. They're influenced by contact with writing cultures, even when they don't adopt writing themselves. They're not isolated in the way prehistoric peoples were. Their knowledge and practices have been shaped by this contact in ways that make them poor analogues of truly prehistoric cultures. Third, even contemporary pre-literate societies are vanishing. Contact with literate industrial societies tends to be destructive of traditional knowledge. Languages die, elders pass away without transmitting their knowledge. Young people adopt new ways and abandon traditional practices. We're losing even this indirect window into pre-literate knowledge systems, so we're left with tantalizing hints of what we've lost. We know that humans before writing were capable of sophisticated thought and had accumulated substantial knowledge. We know this because the humans who transitioned from pre-literacy to literacy demonstrated these capabilities immediately. They didn't have to develop sophistication after inventing writing, they already had it. This suggests that there was substantial intellectual and cultural richness in pre-literate societies that simply isn't visible in the archaeological record. People were thinking deeply about their world, developing complex explanations, creating sophisticated knowledge systems. But because these were maintained orally and not written down, they're lost to us. And some of this lost knowledge might have been valuable. There are documented cases of traditional ecological knowledge passed down orally in indigenous cultures, containing insights that modern science later validated. Understanding of plant properties that led to pharmaceutical discoveries, knowledge of animal behavior that improved conservation efforts, sustainable resource management practices that modern societies are trying to relearn. How much other knowledge like this existed in prehistoric cultures and was lost when those cultures changed or disappeared? We don't know, we can't know, but it was probably substantial. There's also the question of cultural and artistic loss. The stories, songs, dances, ritual practices of pre-literate peoples, almost all lost. We have some art that survived, cave paintings, carved figures, decorated objects, but we don't have the songs that might have accompanied rituals. We don't have the stories that explained the paintings. We don't have the dances, or the performances, or the oral poetry. All of this existed. We know it existed because all human cultures create these things. But in pre-literate societies, these cultural productions were ephemeral. They existed in performance and then were gone, leaving no trace except in the memories of those who experienced them. When we think about what we've lost from prehistory, we need to include this cultural and artistic dimension. Not just knowledge, but beauty. Not just information, but meaning. The ways people made sense of their lives, the ways they expressed their experiences, the ways they connected with each other and with the larger cosmos. This is perhaps the deepest loss, because we can sometimes reconstruct practical knowledge through experimental archaeology or by studying similar environments and problems. But we can't reconstruct the subjective meaning-making, the cultural creativity, the unique ways different peoples understood and expressed their humanity. That's gone, irretrievably. And it represents hundreds of thousands of years of human creativity and cultural production simply vanished. We're living in the afterglow of this loss. The human cultures we can study, even the oldest literate ones, are recent. They're the cultures that happened to survive into the period when writing existed to record them. Everything before that is shadows and fragments. And we need to acknowledge this loss, not just as an academic problem, though it certainly is that, but as a genuine tragedy. Real people with rich inner lives, with valuable knowledge, with unique cultural expressions, lived and died, leaving almost no record. Their experiences, their thoughts, their creations, all lost to time and the absence of writing. We can't recover what's lost, but we can acknowledge it. We can recognize that our understanding of human history is radically incomplete. We can admit that most of what humans have experienced, thought, created, and understood is inaccessible to us. And maybe that acknowledgement can create some humility. Because if we've lost so much from the past, despite our best efforts to preserve and understand it, what might we be losing now? What knowledge exists in living cultures, including pre-literate or recently literate ones, that we're failing to record or value? What will future humans wish they knew about us that we're not preserving? The loss of prehistory isn't just ancient history. It's a warning about the fragility of knowledge and the importance of preservation. It's a reminder that writing, for all its limitations, is a crucial technology for maintaining cultural continuity across time. And it's a call to attention, to notice what's valuable before it's gone, to record what's worth preserving, to respect knowledge in all its forms before it slips away into the darkness of the unremembered past. Let me tell you about one specific moment in the transition from prehistory to history. Not a dramatic moment. History doesn't have moments like that, but a significant one nonetheless. Around 3200 BCE, in Mesopotamia, in the city of Uruk, someone pressed a reed stylus into soft clay and made marks. Not pictures, though the writing system would start with pictographs. Not random marks, but deliberate symbols representing words or concepts. Quantities of grain, probably. Numbers of animals. Simple accounting for a temple or palace bureaucracy. This wasn't the first time someone had made marks to record information. There are earlier clay tokens, small shaped objects used for counting and accounting. There are notched bones and other tally systems, going back much further. But this was different. This was a systematic way of representing language, visually. This was writing. The person who made those marks probably didn't think they were doing anything revolutionary. They were solving a practical problem: how to keep track of resources in an increasingly complex society, how to record who owed what to whom, how to manage inventories that were too large for one person to remember. But what they were actually doing was creating a new kind of memory, external memory, memory that didn't depend on human brains. Memory that could persist indefinitely, that could be consulted by people who weren't present when it was created, that could communicate across time. This is what separates history from prehistory. Not a specific date. Writing was invented independently in different places at different times. Not a specific event. The transition was gradual, with proto-writing systems existing for some time before fully developed writing emerged. But the presence or absence of this external memory system. Once writing exists, we have direct testimony from the past. We can read what people wrote and access their thoughts in their own words. We're no longer limited to material remains and inference. We can know what they said they believed, what they said they did, what they said they fought. Of course, written records have their own limitations. People lie in writing, just as they do in speech. Texts reflect the biases and perspectives of their authors. Records are selective. Some things get written down, others don't. And the survival of texts is random. Most written materials from the ancient world are lost, and what survives is often not representative. But still, it's vastly better than having no written records at all. Even biased, selective, fragmentary texts give us access to the past in ways that material remains alone never can. And once writing exists, knowledge accumulation accelerates dramatically. Ideas can be preserved exactly without the distortion of oral transmission. Technical information can be recorded in detail. Observations can be compiled across generations. Innovations can be documented and disseminated. The difference is visible in the archaeological record. Before writing, cultural change is slow, measured in thousands of years. After writing, it accelerates. New technologies appear more frequently. Social complexity increases. Cultural productions become more elaborate. This isn't because people suddenly became smarter. Cognitively, there's no difference between humans before and after writing. But the tools for thinking and communicating were different. Writing allowed thought to be extended in ways that oral culture couldn't match. You can think on paper in ways you can't think in your head. You can manipulate symbols, rearrange arguments, refer back to earlier ideas, build complex structures of thought that would collapse if you tried to hold them in memory alone. You can collaborate across time. You can build on the work of people who died centuries ago. You can contribute to projects that won't be completed until long after you're dead. Knowledge becomes cumulative in a new way. And you can communicate across space. Written messages can travel further and more reliably than oral messages. Information can spread through populations without degradation. Cultural practices can be standardized through written instructions. All of this emerges from those first marks pressed into clay. All of the literature and philosophy and science and history that we value, all of the accumulated knowledge of civilization, all of the ability to learn from the past and plan for the future, it all depends on this one technology: writing. But here's what troubles me about this transition. When writing emerges, prehistory ends. By definition, we start calling it history because we have written records. But the people experiencing this transition didn't suddenly become different people. The vast majority of the population remained pre-literate for centuries or millennia after writing was invented. Only a small elite had access to writing initially. So for most people, even after writing existed, their experience was still fundamentally oral. They still relied on memory and face-to-face communication. They still transmitted knowledge through demonstration and storytelling. The world before writing wasn't suddenly replaced by the world after writing. The two coexisted for a long time, and even today, even in highly literate societies, oral culture persists. We still tell stories. We still rely on memory for much of what we know. We still learn many things through demonstration and practice rather than through reading instructions. Writing didn't eliminate oral culture, it supplemented it. But writing did change things fundamentally. It created a new kind of human culture, one where the past could be accessed directly rather than through the filter of memory and tradition. One where knowledge could accumulate across generations with high fidelity. One where the human mind could extend itself through external symbols in ways that were impossible before. This is the dividing line between prehistory and history. Not a sharp line. The transition was gradual and uneven, but a real line nonetheless. On one side, human culture limited to oral transmission and material remains. On the other side, human culture augmented by permanent records and the ability to communicate across time. We live on the far side of that line, so far that we can barely imagine what it was like on the other side. So far that pre-literacy seems primitive to us, though the people who lived it were cognitively identical to us. But prehistory is still with us, in the gaps in our knowledge about the past, in the cultures and languages and knowledge systems that were lost before anyone wrote them down, in the reminder that most of human experience has left no permanent trace, and in the warning that writing, for all its power, is fragile. Clay tablets can break, paper can burn, digital storage can corrupt. If we lost the ability to read our written records, through disaster, through cultural disruption, through whatever catastrophe, we'd be back in prehistory in functional terms. We'd have material remains but no access to the knowledge they contain. This has happened before. Linear A, the script of Minoan Crete, is undeciphered. We have texts but can't read them. Rongorongo from Easter Island, undeciphered. The Indus script, undeciphered. These are writing systems that were created, used for generations or centuries, and then lost when the cultures that used them collapsed and no one maintained the knowledge of how to read them. So, even writing doesn't guarantee permanence. It's a powerful tool for preserving knowledge across time, but it requires continuous chains of transmission. It requires people who can read, who value the texts, who maintain them. If those chains break, writing becomes as inaccessible as oral tradition. The world before written history isn't just the distant past, it's a potential future. Anytime writing systems are lost, we return to prehistory, to a world where knowledge lives only in living memory and material remains. This is why the transition from prehistory to history matters, not just as a historical fact, but as an ongoing vulnerability. We're always potentially just 1 or 2 generations away from losing access to our written heritage. Always dependent on transmission and preservation, always at risk of the kind of cultural forgetting that made prehistory largely opaque to us. The world before writing is a world we've left behind, technologically, but it's a world we could return to if we're not careful. And it's a world we should understand, not just for its own sake, but for what it tells us about the fragility of knowledge and the importance of memory, both human and technological, in maintaining cultural continuity across the vast expanse of time. There's one more thing we need to talk about before we finish this journey into the world before writing. Something that brings all of this back to you, sitting here now, in a world saturated with written words. You've been reading these words, or hearing them, if you're listening, and processing them as meaningful symbols. Your brain is doing something extraordinary. It's translating visual patterns or auditory patterns into concepts, assembling those concepts into thoughts, integrating those thoughts into your existing understanding of the world. This isn't natural in the sense that it's innate. No one is born able to read. It's a skill that has to be learned, that requires rewiring your brain to associate arbitrary symbols with sounds and meanings. It takes years of practice. And it's only possible because your culture has a writing system and values literacy enough to teach it. For most of human existence, no one could do this. The human brain was the same, capable of language, of abstract thought, of symbolic reasoning, but the cultural technology of writing didn't exist, so that capability was expressed differently. Think about what that means. You and a person from 50,000 years ago have essentially the same brain, same cognitive capacities, same ability to learn, to reason, to create, to understand. But their thoughts lived only in their mind and in spoken words. Your thoughts can be externalized, preserved, transmitted across time and space through writing. This isn't a difference in intelligence or capability, it's a difference in tools. You have access to a technology, writing, that extends your mind beyond its biological limitations. That allows you to think thoughts too complex to hold in memory alone. That allows you to learn from people who died centuries ago. That allows you to contribute to conversations that will continue long after you die. And you probably take this for granted, because you've had it your whole life. Because in your world, written words are everywhere. On screens, on signs, in books, on products. Reading and writing are so fundamental to modern life that it's hard to imagine existing without them. But for most of human history, people did exist without them. But they lived full lives, had complex thoughts, created meaningful cultures, all without ever reading or writing a single word. What were they missing? From their perspective, probably nothing. They didn't know that writing was possible, so they didn't feel its absence. They had oral culture, material culture, social culture. They had ways of transmitting knowledge, preserving memory, creating meaning, different ways than ours, but not necessarily inferior for their context. What we're missing by not having access to their inner lives, that's substantial. We're missing their stories, their insights, their understandings. We're missing most of human history in the sense of lived experience and cultural meaning. But here's what's strange. In losing prehistory, in having almost no access to the thoughts and beliefs of pre-literate peoples, we've also lost something of ourselves. Because we're descended from them, genetically, certainly, but also culturally. The humans who first developed language, who first created art, who first wondered about the stars and told stories about where we came from, they're our ancestors. Their questions are our questions. Their creativity is our creativity. And yet, we're separated from them by the absence of writing. We can't hear their voices. We can't know their answers to the eternal questions. We can't learn from their hard-won wisdom except in the most indirect ways. This creates a kind of existential loneliness, where humans trying to understand what it means to be human, but we're cut off from most of human experience. We're working with a tiny sample, the most recent 5,000 years, the cultures that happen to develop writing and whose texts happen to survive. Everything else is silence. Not emptiness. We know people were there, living and thinking and creating, but silence in the sense that we can't hear them. We can't access their testimony. We can only infer, guess, imagine. And yet, in that silence, there's also something profound, because it reminds us of our own mortality and the mortality of our cultures. Everything we're creating, all the words we're writing, all the knowledge we're accumulating, it could be lost. Future humans could look back at our time the way we look back at prehistory, with only fragmentary material remains and no access to our thoughts and beliefs. This isn't inevitable. We have better preservation technologies than previous eras. We're creating redundant copies of important information. We're archiving extensively, but it's not impossible. Climate change, war, social collapse, technological failure, any number of scenarios could disrupt the transmission of knowledge to future generations. And on a personal level, this is happening all the time. Every time an elderly person dies without passing on their knowledge and experiences, some part of human history is lost. Every time a language dies, a unique way of understanding the world disappears. Every time a culture is disrupted or destroyed, accumulated wisdom and tradition vanishes. We're living through a kind of continuous low-level prehistory right now, losing knowledge and cultural practices that aren't being recorded or valued. Watching the diversity of human experience narrow as global culture becomes more homogeneous. This is why understanding the world before writing matters, not just as historical knowledge, but as a lens for seeing our own time, for recognizing what we're losing, for appreciating what we've preserved, for understanding the fragility of knowledge and the importance of transmission. The people of prehistory were us. We're the people of prehistory's future. We're the beneficiaries of whatever knowledge they managed to pass down despite having no way to write it, and we're the custodians of knowledge for humans yet to come. Whether we fulfill that custodianship well or poorly will determine what future humans know about us. Whether they'll be able to access our thoughts and understand our time, or whether they'll look back at us the way we look back at prehistory, with fragmentary evidence and enormous gaps in understanding. The world before written history is vast and mostly dark to us. But in confronting that darkness, in acknowledging how much we don't and can't know about the human past, we might learn to value what we do know, to preserve it carefully, to transmit it faithfully, to add to it thoughtfully, and maybe, in doing that, we can avoid becoming prehistory ourselves. We can maintain the chain of transmission that connects past to present to future. We can be good ancestors to people who don't exist yet, the way we wish our distant ancestors had been better able to communicate across the vast gulf of time that separates us from them. It's late now, or early, depending on how you measure time. The world has gone quiet around you. And you've been thinking about people who lived tens of thousands of years ago, people who looked at the same stars you see, but understood them differently, people who asked the same questions you ask, but had different answers, or no answers at all. They're gone, all of them. Every person who lived before writing, who had no way to send their thoughts forward through time, who existed and thought and felt and created and then died, leaving barely a trace. Hundreds of billions of individual human lives, each one as complex and real as yours, all vanished into silence. And yet, they're not entirely gone. Because you're here, you exist because they survived. Your capacity for language, for abstract thought, for creating and understanding symbols, that's their legacy. Your brain is their brain, evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, shaped by the challenges they faced and the solutions they developed. You're carrying them with you. In your genes, yes, but also in the very structure of your cognition. The way you perceive the world, the way you process information, the way you make meaning, all of this is built on foundations they laid, adaptations they developed, capacities they evolved. Where would the danger fit? They couldn't write to you, but they made you, and in that sense, they're speaking still. Through you, through all of us, through the continued existence of the human lineage and the perpetuation of human consciousness. The world before written history isn't just the past, it's the foundation. It's the long, slow preparation for everything that came after. It's where we became human in all the ways that matter, where we developed language and art and music and story and wonder and grief and love. Writing came later, a recent innovation, a powerful tool, but not the beginning. The beginning is lost in the unrecorded, the depths spoken by people who had no way to preserve them, in the first questions asked by minds that were already fully human, but had no writing to capture their thoughts. We can't recover that beginning, but we can honor it. We can acknowledge that we're the heirs of a vast, unwritten history. We can remember that most of human experience has left no trace except in the existence of humans themselves. We can look at the night sky the way our ancestors did and feel connected across time, even without words to bridge the gap. And we can write. We can use this tool they didn't have. We can preserve our thoughts, our knowledge, our questions, our attempts at answers We can send messages forward to humans who don't exist yet, the way we wish our distant ancestors could have sent messages to us. Not because we have better answers, not because we understand more, but because we can. Because writing gives us a way to reach across time, to connect with past and future, to participate in a conversation that spans generations. The world before written history is mostly darkness, but it's not empty darkness. It's full of people who lived and thought and felt, who faced the fundamental questions of existence without the tools we have, who created meaning in a world that offered no permanent records. They're gone. But not forgotten, even though we don't remember them individually, because forgetting would require having known in the first place, and we never knew them. We were born into their future, benefiting from their legacy, but separated from their experience by an unbridgeable gap of time and the absence of words. Still, on nights like this, in the quiet darkness, you can feel them. Not as individuals, their names and faces are lost forever, but as a presence, a foundation, the long human story that made your story possible. The world before writing, before history, before permanent records, it was real, it mattered, and it's still with us in ways we can barely articulate, but somehow feel. Sleep well, dream of those who came before. And when you wake, write something down, anything, just to mark the fact that you were here, that you thought something, that you existed. It's a small act, but it's an act those who came before couldn't do. And it's a gift to those who will come after. The darkness of prehistory is vast, but we're creating light, word by word, preserving what we can, reaching across time with symbols pressed into clay or pixels on screens. It's not enough to recover what was lost, but it's something. It's our way of saying, we were here, we thought, we wondered, we tried to understand. And maybe that's all we can do, all we've ever been able to do. Try to understand, try to remember, try to pass something forward to the future, hoping it matters, knowing it might not, doing it anyway because we're human, and that's what humans do. But we're not yet. So we keep writing, keep speaking, keep trying to make meaning in the brief time we have, before we too become prehistory to people who will look back at us and wonder what we were thinking, what we knew, who we were. And the cycle continues, always has, always will, until there's no one left to wonder, or to write, or to remember. But that's not tonight. Tonight, we're still here, still thinking, still reaching across the darkness of time with words, still human.